For most of recorded history, war has not been the exception, it has been the rule. Scholars estimate that in the past 5,000 years, humanity has lived through fewer than 300 years of general peace. That is less than 6% of our recorded existence spent without organized, large-scale violence somewhere on this earth. We might ask then, is war simply what we are? Is conflict the natural grammar of human civilization, the default language through which nations, peoples, and powers speak to one another when words run out? Consider what war actually costs, not in the abstract, in the concrete. In Ukraine, since February 2022, millions of civilians have been displaced from their homes. Cities that stood for centuries, Mariupol, Kharkiv, Bakhmut, have been reduced to rubble. Children have grown up knowing the sound of air raid sirens better than the sound of school bells. In Gaza, a conflict with roots stretching back decades has, in its most recent form, produced one of the most concentrated humanitarian crises in modern memory. The question of proportionality, of how much destruction is legally and morally permissible, has been debated in international courts while the destruction itself continues. In Sudan, a civil war that erupted in 2023 has killed tens of thousands and displaced more than 10 million people, making it one of the largest displacement crises in the world. And yet, it receives a fraction of the global attention given to conflicts in wealthier regions. These are not ancient histories. These are current realities, and they raise a question that cannot be avoided. If this is the world as it is, if war is this persistent, this costly, this present, then what does it mean to speak of a world without war? Is it naivety? Is it ideology? Or is it something more serious, a political and ethical obligation that humanity has not yet found the courage to fully institutionalize? That is the question this series will explore. Not with the assumption that peace is easy, not with the pretense that conflict can be wished away, but with the conviction that how we answer this question, whether we treat war as inevitable or as a failure of civilization, determines the kind of world we are building for those who come after us. The question is not whether peace is possible. The question is whether we are willing to do the difficult, incremental, institutional work that peace actually requires. We begin here, with the weight of what war costs, and the honest admission that we have not yet paid enough attention to the price. Chapter 2: The Ukraine War, the Cost of Modern Territorial Conflict. On the 24th of February 2022, Russian armed forces crossed into Ukraine in what the Kremlin called a special military operation. The world called it something else, an invasion. The largest land war in Europe since the Second World War. What followed has been documented in satellite images, in court filings, in the testimonies of survivors, and in the daily casualty reports that have become, for much of the world, background noise. But numbers should not become background noise. So let us be specific. Millions of Ukrainians fled their homes. Cities that had stood for centuries were shelled into rubble. Mariupol, a port city of nearly 500,000 people, was encircled, bombarded, and largely destroyed. Hospitals were struck, maternity wards, schools, residential apartment blocks. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants. Investigators documented evidence of war crimes. The question of accountability, of whether international law has teeth, became urgent and, so far, largely unanswered. What the Ukraine war reveals is not simply the brutality of one aggressor. It reveals the structural fragility of the international order. The rules exist, the institutions exist, and yet the war continues. This is the central problem. Not that we lack norms against aggressive war, we have them. The United Nations Charter prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity of another state. The prohibition is clear, the violation was clear, and the war happened anyway. So we must ask, what is an international norm worth when the mechanisms for enforcing it are paralyzed by the veto power of the very states most likely to violate it? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a design problem, a problem of institutional architecture. And it is exactly the kind of problem that a serious commitment to global peace must grapple with. Not by pretending the problem does not exist, but by asking, with discipline and urgency, how the architecture might be improved. The people of Ukraine did not choose this war. They chose, in 2019, a president on a platform of peace. What they received instead is a lesson the world has learned many times before and not yet learned well enough. That the absence of war requires more than the desire for peace. It requires structures strong enough to make aggression too costly to attempt. We do not yet have those structures. Building them is the work.
Chapter 3. Gaza, Asymmetric War and the Limits of International Law. Few conflicts in modern memory have generated more international debate and less resolution than the situation in Gaza. The history is long and layered. The competing claims are real, and for those living them, existential. This series will not pretend to adjudicate those claims. What it will do is examine what the conflict reveals about the limits of the frameworks we have built to constrain war. International humanitarian law, the laws of war, rests on several core principles. Distinction. Combatants must be distinguished from civilians. Proportionality. The anticipated civilian harm of an attack must not be excessive relative to the expected military advantage. Precaution. All feasible measures must be taken to avoid civilian casualties. These principles are not aspirational. They are binding under international law. They apply to all parties in all conflicts, regardless of the justice or injustice of the underlying cause. And yet in Gaza, these principles have been tested to their breaking point, and, according to many international legal scholars, human rights organizations, and United Nations investigators, broken. The density of the population, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, the scale of displacement, the interruption of food, water, and medical supply. These are not merely tragic facts. They are facts that carry legal weight and that demand legal analysis. At the same time, the questions do not run in only one direction. The use of civilian infrastructure by armed groups, the taking of hostages, the deliberate targeting of civilians on the 7th of October 2023. These too are facts that carry legal weight. What asymmetric conflict reveals is a fundamental tension in the laws of war. Those laws were largely designed for conflicts between states with standing armies. When one party operates from within a civilian population, whether by necessity or by choice, the application of proportionality becomes genuinely contested. Not because the principle is wrong, but because its application in such conditions is extraordinarily difficult. This difficulty is real. It does not excuse violations, but it does tell us something important. The legal frameworks we have are insufficient for the conflicts we actually face, and insufficiency in this domain costs lives. The work of building a more peaceful world is also the work of building better law. Chapter 4. Sudan, the war the world forgot. In April 2023, fighting broke out in Khartoum between two rival military factions, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. Within weeks, the conflict had spread across the country. Within months, it had become one of the worst humanitarian crises on Earth. By the end of 2024, more than 10 million people had been displaced, the largest displacement crisis in the world. Tens of thousands had been killed,
famine had been declared in parts of the country. Reports of mass atrocities, sexual violence used as a weapon of war, and the deliberate targeting of civilian populations had been documented by United Nations investigators and human rights organizations. And yet, the war in Sudan received a fraction of the international attention devoted to conflicts in Europe or the Middle East. This disparity is itself a moral fact. It tells us something about whose suffering is considered legible, whose wars are considered important, and whose lives are implicitly valued more than others. The philosopher Judith Butler has written about the concept of grievability, the idea that not all lives are treated as equally worthy of mourning. Some deaths produce international outcry, others produce silence. The geography of attention is not neutral. It reflects hierarchies of power, proximity, and perceived relevance that have deep roots in the history of colonialism and racial inequality. This is not a comfortable observation. It is a necessary one, because a serious commitment to global peace cannot be selective. It cannot apply only to conflicts that are televised, only to victims who are photographed, only to wars that happen in places the powerful care about. If human dignity is the foundation, if the argument against war rests on the irreducible worth of every human life, then that argument must apply everywhere, or it applies nowhere. Sudan is a test of whether we mean what we say. So far, the world has largely failed that test. Acknowledging the failure is the beginning of doing better.
Chapter 5. What is peace? Negative and positive definitions. We use the word peace as though its meaning were obvious. It is not. The most common understanding of peace is negative. Peace is the absence of war. No bombs falling, no armies crossing borders, no organized killing. This is peace as silence, the quiet that follows when the guns stop. This negative definition is not wrong. The absence of war is genuinely valuable. People who are not being bombed are better off than people who are. The cessation of violence is always worth pursuing. But the negative definition is incomplete, and its incompleteness matters. The Norwegian peace theorist Johan Galtung introduced a distinction that has become foundational in peace studies: the difference between negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is the absence of direct violence, war, killing, armed conflict. Positive peace is something more demanding: the presence of conditions that make direct violence unnecessary and unlikely. Justice, equity, functioning institutions, the rule of law, access to basic needs, the recognition of human dignity across all groups. A society can have negative peace, no open warfare, while still being structured by what Galtung called structural violence, the systematic harm caused by unjust social arrangements, poverty that shortens lives, discrimination that forecloses possibilities, exclusion that silences voices. These are forms of violence too, even when no weapon is fired. This distinction matters for how we think about global peace. A world without war is necessary, but not sufficient. A world in which the conditions that produce war, inequality, impunity, exclusion, the denial of dignity, remain intact is a world in which war will return. Positive peace requires building the institutions, the norms, the habits of cooperation and mutual recognition that make conflict resolution possible without violence. This is harder than stopping a war. It is slower, it is less dramatic, it does not make headlines, but it is the only kind of peace that lasts. Chapter 6. The United Nations, Intention and Reality. In 1945, in the aftermath of the deadliest war in human history,
the nations of the world gathered in San Francisco to sign a document that began with these words: "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind." The United Nations Charter was an act of institutional imagination. Its architects, traumatized by 2 world wars in 30 years, believed that if the right structures could be built, if the right rules could be codified and agreed upon, then the cycle of catastrophic violence might be broken. The results have been mixed, profoundly mixed. On one hand, the post-1945 period has seen no direct conflict between the major nuclear powers. The number of interstate wars has declined significantly compared to earlier centuries. Decolonization, however imperfect, proceeded largely without a Third World War. The development of international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and human rights law has created normative frameworks that, even when violated, establish standards against which violations can be measured and condemned. These are real achievements. They should not be dismissed. On the other hand, the United Nations has repeatedly failed to prevent wars that it had the legal mandate to prevent. The Security Council, the body with primary responsibility for international peace and security, is structurally paralyzed by the veto power of its 5 permanent members. When one of those members is the aggressor or the ally of the aggressor, the Council cannot act. This is not a design flaw that was overlooked. It was a deliberate compromise made in 1945 to persuade the great powers to join. The price of their participation was the guarantee that they could never be compelled. That price has been paid over and over in the lives of people in places the Security Council failed to protect. The United Nations is neither a failure nor a success. It is an unfinished project. The question is whether humanity has the will to finish it. Chapter 7: The Philosophy of Self-Defense. Where is the line? The strongest argument against global peace as a norm is also the most honest one. Sometimes people need to defend themselves, and sometimes the only tool available for defense is force. This is a serious argument. It deserves a serious answer. The tradition of just war theory, developed over centuries by thinkers from Augustine to Aquinas to Michael Walzer, attempts to define the conditions under which the use of military force can be morally justified. It does not say war is good. It says that in a world where aggressors exist, the complete renunciation of force may itself be a moral failure, a failure to protect the innocent. The core conditions are demanding. A just war must have a just cause, typically self-defense or the defense of others against unjust aggression. It must be declared by a legitimate authority. It must be a last resort, undertaken only after other means have been exhausted. It must have a reasonable chance of success, and it must be conducted with proportionality. The harm caused must not exceed the harm prevented. These conditions matter. They are not merely academic. They are the difference between defense and aggression, between protection and revenge, between a war that is regrettable and a war that is criminal. But here is the difficulty. In practice, the language of just war is routinely hijacked. Every aggressor claims self-defense. Every party to a conflict claims proportionality. The history of warfare is a history of atrocities committed under the banner of justice. This does not make the framework wrong. It makes it dangerous to leave unpoliced. The philosophical boundary of legitimate self-defense is real, but it requires external arbitration, institutions with the authority and the independence to say, this is defense and this is not. This is proportionate and this has crossed a line. We have the beginnings of such institutions. We do not yet have their full authority. That is the gap we must close. Chapter 8:
The possibility of diplomacy. 2 case studies. History is not only a record of wars, it is also a record of moments when war was avoided, when human beings facing catastrophe chose negotiation over destruction. 2 cases are worth examining closely. The first is the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. For 13 days in October, the United States and the Soviet Union stood at the edge of nuclear war. Soviet missiles had been placed in Cuba. American naval forces had established a blockade. Both sides were armed, alert, and under enormous pressure from military advisors who on both sides were prepared to recommend the use of force. What prevented nuclear war was not military superiority. It was communication, back-channel diplomacy, the willingness of both Kennedy and Khrushchev to find a face-saving exit that neither side had to call a defeat. The missiles were removed, the blockade was lifted, a direct telephone line, the famous hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow. The world did not know how close it had come, but it survived. The second case is the Northern Ireland peace process, culminating in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, a conflict that had lasted 30 years, that had killed over 3,000 people, that had seemed intractable, was ended through negotiation. Not because the underlying grievances disappeared, they did not, but because political leaders on multiple sides, supported by sustained international mediation, chose to build institutions that could manage those grievances without violence. The agreement was imperfect, its implementation has been uneven, but the killings stopped, and it stayed stopped. These cases do not prove that all conflicts can be resolved through diplomacy. They prove that some can, including ones that appeared impossible, and they reveal what diplomacy actually requires: time, patience, creativity, political courage, and the willingness to let the other side claim something as a victory. These are not exotic virtues. They are learnable, they are teachable, they are institutional. Chapter 9. Human Dignity as the Foundation. Every serious argument against war ultimately rests on a claim about human beings, that they matter, that their lives have value that cannot be calculated away, that they are not merely instruments of someone else's political will, not statistics in a strategic calculation, not acceptable losses in the pursuit of national interest. This is the concept of human dignity, and it is more philosophically demanding than it first appears. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant articulated it this way: human beings must always be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as means. A person cannot be used as a tool for another's purposes without their consent. Their humanity, their capacity for reason, for choice, for moral agency, places them beyond the reach of pure instrumentalization. Applied to war, this principle is devastating. War, at its core, involves treating human beings, soldiers and civilians alike, as means to political ends. It kills people in order to achieve objectives. It destroys lives in the service of strategies. Even when those strategies are defensible, the human cost is a moral weight that cannot simply be zeroed out by the justice of the cause. This does not mean that Kant's principle makes all war automatically impermissible. Even Kant himself did not conclude that. But it means that every act of war must be justified against the standard of human dignity, and that the bar for justification is extraordinarily high. John Rawls, writing in the 20th century, extended this framework to the international level. A just society, and by extension, a just international order, is one that reasonable people could agree to from behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing which country they would be born into, which side of a border they would find themselves on, which ethnicity or religion or language they would inherit.
From behind that veil, would reasonable people agree to a world in which war remains a normal instrument of politics? The answer, I think, is no. And that answer is the beginning of a politics of peace.
Chapter 10. The Strongest Counterargument. What if violence cannot be stopped? We have spent 9 chapters building a case for peace as a political and ethical imperative. Now we must take seriously the argument against it. Not the weak version, but the strongest version. The strongest version goes like this. Suppose there is a party to a conflict that is determined to use force to achieve its ends. Suppose that party has no interest in negotiation, no respect for international law, no concern for the lives of civilians. Suppose that diplomacy has been tried and has failed. Suppose that international institutions have proven incapable of stopping the harm. In that situation, is a commitment to peace not simply a commitment to defeat? Is it not, in practice, an instruction to the victim to accept their own suffering? This is a serious argument. It cannot be dismissed. It is the argument that justified armed resistance in the darkest chapters of the 20th century. It is the argument that underwrites the right to self-defense in international law. It is the argument that millions of people in active conflict zones are living right now. And it is correct, up to a point. The point at which it becomes problematic is when it is used not as a last resort, but as a first resort. When it is used not to protect the innocent, but to pursue political objectives achievable through other means. When it is used not to stop harm, but to perpetuate it under a different name. The history of conflict is full of genuine self-defense. It is also full of parties who describe themselves as defenders while causing immense harm to others. The philosophical task is not to deny the legitimacy of self-defense. It is to insist on the conditions that make it legitimate, and to build institutions capable of distinguishing, with authority and reliability, between defense and aggression. That is difficult. It is not impossible, and the difficulty does not excuse us from the attempt. Chapter 11. From Defense to Justice, Breaking the Cycle of Violence. Every war produces its own sequel. This is one of the most consistent findings of conflict research. Wars that end without genuine resolution tend to recur. The grievances that produced the first conflict, if unaddressed, become the fuel for the next. This is the cycle of violence, and breaking it is perhaps the hardest problem in the entire field of peace studies. Consider what happens at the end of a war. There are winners and losers. The winners are exhausted and traumatized. The losers are humiliated and resentful. The infrastructure is destroyed. The institutions are weakened. The social trust is shattered. Children have grown up knowing only war. Entire communities have been organized around the logic of conflict, their economies, their identities, their relationships to each other. Into this landscape, peace must be built, not just declared, built. The post-conflict literature is clear about what works and what does not. What does not work? Victor's justice, imposed settlements, the exclusion of significant parties from peace negotiations, the absence of accountability for atrocities, the failure to address underlying grievances. What works, imperfectly, provisionally, but demonstrably, is something closer to what the philosopher John Paul Lederach calls moral imagination, the capacity to imagine oneself in relationship with the enemy, to hold the complexity of the other's humanity without abandoning the memory of the harm they caused. This is not forgiveness in the sense of forgetting. It is something more demanding, the willingness to build a future with people you have every reason to hate, because the alternative is to hand the next generation the same war. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission was imperfect. Rwanda's Gacaca courts were imperfect. The Dayton Agreement was imperfect. But they were attempts, serious, sustained attempts, to break the cycle rather than continue it.
Peace is not the end of conflict. It is the decision to resolve conflict differently.
Chapter 12. Conclusion: The Direction of Civilization. We began this series with a question. If war has been so persistent throughout human history, is global peace merely a naive ideal? We end with an answer. Not a simple answer, not a comfortable one, but an honest one. Global peace is not naive. It is not a utopia. It is not a fantasy entertained only by those who have never faced real danger. It is a direction, a normative horizon, a standard against which the choices of states, institutions, and individuals can be measured and found adequate or inadequate. The argument of this series has been straightforward. War causes harm of such magnitude to lives, to dignity, to the social fabric that makes human flourishing possible, that it demands the highest level of moral and political scrutiny. The burden of justification for any act of organized violence is extraordinarily high, and the work of building alternatives, legal, diplomatic, institutional, is not optional. It is the central task of political civilization. We have made progress. The international legal order that emerged after 1945, for all its failures, represents a genuine advance over what came before. The development of human rights law, international criminal law, and the norms of humanitarian protection has created a vocabulary of accountability that did not exist a century ago. But progress is not completion. The gap between the norms we have proclaimed and the reality we have built remains vast. And in that gap, people die. The question this series leaves with you is not whether you believe in peace as an abstraction. It is whether you are willing to support the concrete, unglamorous, incremental work of building the institutions that make peace possible. Not because it is easy, because it is necessary. Peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the presence of justice. And justice, in the end, is what civilization is for.